So starting us off like we always do, number 10, we're starting off with the world's oldest drug mule. This right here is 91-year-old Leo Sharp. He was actually released early from prison because he's terminally ill. I didn't know that this was a thing, that, you know, terminally ill people who committed horrible crimes can just be released. Maybe this is just a one-off. Leo Sharp drove a ton of drugs for El Chapo's cartel. He mostly drove cocaine, killing people along the way. It's unknown how many people he's actually killed, but there's a pretty big death toll, and this is all because of El Chapo's cartel. El Chapo is a very dangerous guy who has been in and out of prison his whole life. He has actually escaped a couple times from prison as well. This guy's worth $1 billion, and he has so many people working for him, including this guy we're talking about right now, Leo Sharp. Alright, moving on this list, at number 9, we have two best friends, Ricky Jackson and Willie Bridgman. And they were arrested at the age of 16 years old for a murder that took place in Cleveland, Ohio. Harold Franks was the victim. Well, he was attacked with acid and he was shot twice with a .38 caliber gun. Both teenagers received the death penalty back in 1977, but it was later turned over to life imprisoned.
Yes.
It was young Vernon's testimony that put Jackson on death row.
I could halfway accept my punishment if I was guilty, but, excuse me.
This story takes a huge turn because after spending 40 years behind bars, a judge released them, and the judge said they actually have the wrong people. Ricky and Willie were convicted after a false testimony that was given by a 12-year-old boy. These two friends didn't commit the crime, so for the past 40 years they were serving time for someone else's crime. Their lives has been taken away from them.
Words can't express how I feel right now. I'm just glad to be out, glad to be a free man.
What are you going to do today? Where are you going to go?
Wow. I mean, you know, you sit in prison for so long, you think about this day, but when it actually comes, you don't know what you just want to do something, you know?
This guy missed out on school, getting his first job, finding a wife, having kids. Being a teenager, you get to experience a lot of things in life, and it is a very important and crucial time in someone's life. Number 8, we have Howard Christensen. He is a Chicago native who became the nation's longest serving prisoner before he finally completed his time. At the age of 17 years old, Howard committed murder and was given a life sentence without parole to 200 years in prison. But that was later overturned to a 64-year prison sentence, which is pretty much life in prison. Well, Howard actually outlived his prison sentence and was able to see the light of day. Well, just for a few years. Howard was 79 years old when he was finally released. Howard was only able to live 2 years as a free man before he passed away. Moving right along here, we have Bobby Bostic, and he comes onto our list at number 7. Bobby was just 16 years old when he was convicted of committing 17 crimes. Some of them include robbery and kidnapping. He fired a gun at 2 people. While he has been in prison for more than 20 years now, he is now in his 40s. Bobby on our list has one of the longest prison sentences. He was actually sentenced to 241 years. Many people believe that this was way too harsh for this crime. Murder was not committed, although there was near death. Back in 2010, the Supreme Court decided that their initial decision was unconstitutional and minors should have the opportunity to demonstrate maturity and rehabilitation. Even with that though, Bobby won't be eligible for parole until he's 112 years old. So if somehow he's able to outlive that, he has a chance of being a free man one day. Let's talk about a case I've paid close attention to. I've been very fascinated with it. Well, at number 6, let's talk about Brendan Dassey. Probably sounds familiar to you guys. I talk about him a whole lot. Well, he's a nephew of Stephen Avery, the guy from Making a Murder documentary. It's on Netflix.
How you doing, buddy?
Good.
Then they sat down with Brendan. Brendan's lawyers say investigators took advantage of him. Then just 16 years old and with a low IQ, manipulating him into making a false confession.
Brendan Dassey was just 16 years old when he was convicted of first-degree murder and second-degree sexual assault mutilation of a corpse. I believe Brendan Dassey is innocent and was framed. He was sentenced to life in prison with the earliest possibility of parole in 2048. So that's when Brendan Dassey turns 58 years old. Right now he's 28 years old. Stephen Avery, his uncle, is also still in prison, and he has served 18 years for a crime he never committed. He was released, but then he was sentenced again for a new crime, and I don't believe he committed that either. I think he was framed by the same people who convicted him wrongly the first time. So in total, Steven Avery has been in prison for 30 years, and you know what, I can't wait for season 2 of Making a Murderer to be released on Netflix because I need answers. And actually at number 5, let's talk about Steven Avery a little bit more. He was also a teenager when he was first in prison. Steven was 18 years old when he was convicted of sexual assault and attempted murder, and this was back in 1985. Like I said, after 18 years and after DNA testing became more available, it was proven that Steven Avery was actually the wrong guy and evidence was tampered with by local police. He was serving a 30-year sentence.
Back home, relatives waited patiently. After 18 years, the last few hours were the longest, until finally, the reunion.
Too long, though, too long. Oh, God, I love you, baby.
Steven Avery was only free for a few years until he was convicted for a murder. This was back in 2007, and he was given a life imprisonment sentence.
They keep on trying to do something with me. They're trying to find ends. They don't believe none of us. You know, whatever we say, they just don't. We're all liars.
And next up, number 4, we have 65-year-old Wilbert Jones, who was just 19 years old when he was sentenced to prison. He served 46 years for a crime that he didn't even commit. His conviction was just recently overturned. Back in 1971, Jones was found guilty of kidnapping and sexually assaulting a nurse in Louisiana. Apparently, authorities withheld evidence that could have exonerated Jones decades ago. I think this man should have been rewarded millions of dollars, although money won't give his life back. The state of Louisiana took away this man's life. I would be super upset in this situation, but for some reason Jones, he's just thankful for being free.
No, I forgave. You know what I'm saying? I forgive. Because the love of God and the Holy Spirit in my life, I don't have no bit in my life. I got to go the rest of my life.
Number 3, we have James Robertson, who actually inspired a new documentary on Netflix called I Am a Killer. I'm currently watching it and it's really good. I don't know why I'm so interested in these topics, but they just fascinate me. And I swear, if I wasn't a YouTuber, I'd want to get into criminal psychology or work for Netflix and create these documentaries. James Robertson has had a whole life of crime. He was just 16 years old when he was sent to prison, but his crime started at a much younger age. He grew up with a family that are alcoholics and abusive. Robert is currently in prison for a crime he committed back in 1980, and it was for theft. He has been in prison for the past 37 years. For 20 of those years, James Robertson was left in solitary confinement because he was hard to deal with. So for 23 hours in the day, he's stuck in a very tiny dark room. He doesn't get much visitations. Actually, I don't think he's allowed them at all. Barely no sunlight. And when he does get out of his cell for 1 hour a day, he's in another small cage outside. So James couldn't take this anymore, so he decided to kill his new cellmate, who was a pedophile, because he wanted to be placed on death row. I mean, is this real life right now? While on death row, the rules are different. You actually get a bed to sleep on, you actually get more food to eat, you get medical care. Also, James didn't want to be in prison while he was older because he said, well, he's just going to become an easy target for people to beat up. So he just wants to leave the world. So crazy, because he was just trying to fight for the death penalty, but it took him a long time to actually get it, this is a very unusual request. Number 2, we have Joseph Ligon, who was just 15 years old when he was convicted of murdering 2 people back in 1953. Well, it's been 63 years since he was first sentenced to prison. Currently, Joseph is about 80 years old, and he has spent most of his life in a Philadelphia prison. He actually made it into the news a few years ago because he was given the chance of parole, but he turned it down. Joseph rejected this deal out of principle. He claims that he didn't kill anyone. It's really sad, and you know what? There are thousands of innocent people who are in prison serving times for crimes they didn't commit, and Joseph is probably one of them. Why would he choose to continue to fight for his innocence even when he could be released from prison? So now he is the longest serving juvenile lifer in the world that has been documented. And finally, we have made it to number 1. We have Paul Giedel Jr. And he is known to have served the longest prison sentence in the United States. Back in 1911, Paul was convicted of second-degree murder at the age of 17 years old. When Paul was released from prison, he was 86 years old, meaning he was in prison for 68 years. He was locked away in many different New York State prisons. Paul lived to see the day when he was actually released from prison. When Paul was paroled from prison, he didn't want to leave because that was the only life that he knew. He would probably go into shell shock because the world, it just changes so fast. He was in prison from 1911 to 1979. So let me tell you guys quickly what was invented during that time. So just to name a few, we had radio broadcasting, helicopters, microwaves, ovens, credit cards, widescreen cinemas, videotape recorders, video games, man went to space, computers were a new thing, and I mean all of those things. If you lived in prison, you probably never had any access to any of them. I don't even know if you get newspapers or if you read about it. A new computer, well, what is that? But if you get released into the new world, it can be very confusing.
Starting off this countdown, we have the Man in the Iron Mask. The Man in the Iron Mask is the name given to an unidentified prisoner arrested in 1669 or 1670. He was imprisoned during the reign of King Louis XIV of France. Now, what's so scary about this prisoner is how his identity was always kept unknown. He was forced to wear a mask that blocked off his face. Some say he wore a black velvet mask, while others reported that it was a full-on iron mask. Apparently, the guards were ordered to shoot this man if he ever removed the mask. On top of that, he was kept in solitary confinement with double doors. He spent the rest of his life there until he died on November 19th, 1703.
Kellyak, who was serving a 50-year prison sentence, well, after just 19 years, he has been released into society. Sam was convicted back in 1998 for robbing a Lake Worth pawn shop when he was just 15 years old. And since then, his life revolved around prison rules and being confined. Well, it was a Palm Beach County judge that suspended the sentence out of nowhere, and Sam was ordered to be released immediately at the age of 34 years old. He was supposed to be released until he was 65. I'm sure for the rest of his life, he's gonna live an honest life and try to stay out of prison, although it wasn't his fault. So like I was saying in the intro, you can never say you will never go to prison, because you could be framed, you could be convicted for a crime you never committed. Okay, moving into number 8, we have Adam Gray, who served 20 years for a crime he didn't commit. Adam was sentenced to life when he was just 14 years old, and this is when he was convicted of setting a fire that killed 2 people back in 1993. He actually confessed after 7 hours of police interrogating him without his parents or attorney present. He said he couldn't take it anymore, and he just told the detective whatever the heck they wanted to hear. This is why interrogating could be a negative thing. We all know what happened with the Brandon Dassey case, right? You know, the Netflix show Making a Murderer?
Come on, Brandon, be honest. You can do it. Just tell us the truth. I grabbed her arm, put it on the side, and tied her up.
Are we looking? Alright, number 7, we have DeMarlo Antwin. Well, he was just freed from prison after 23 years behind bars for a crime he didn't commit. DeMarlo was 19 years old when he was arrested, and he was charged for a murder. Well, now that he's released, unfortunately, because the crime he committed was in Nevada, and he was arrested in Nevada, he actually isn't entitled to any compensation funds for being wrongly convicted. So it just sucks he was wrongly convicted in the wrong state. Nevada is actually one of 18 states in the nation that doesn't provide anything for people who were imprisoned falsely. 4% of Nevada's inmates have been wrongly convicted, which is around 500 people. Alright, moving into number 6, let me take you guys over to Pennsylvania, where 43-year-old Shaurn Thomas has just recently walked out of the county correctional facility as a free man. After serving 24 years behind bars, a judge has thrown out his conviction for the 1990 murder of a businessman in North Philadelphia. This was because recently there has been some new evidence that prove Shaurn was actually the wrong person. Thomas told the media when he was released, and I quote, "I felt the justice system was going to prevail sooner or later and that somebody would hear my cries." Shaurn has been locked away since he was 16 years old. When he was 19, he was sentenced to life in prison. Well, luckily now he is out. And let's just hope he wasn't in prison in one of those states that don't pay you money for being wrongly convicted, because he should be entitled to millions of dollars. Number 5, let's talk about Anthony Sanborn Jr. He was found guilty of murder when he was just 16 years old for murdering 16-year-old Jessica L. Briggs. Anthony was tried as an adult and was convicted back in 1992 after a 9-day trial. He was sentenced to 70 years in prison. Anthony claims that he's never killed anyone, and he's actually maintained his innocence. 25 years after the murder, a key witness actually took back their testimony, which came as a shock to the courtroom. The witness said they actually didn't witness this killing. The judge, who was presented with the lack of evidence to prove this was the right person who committed the crime, dropped all charges, and Antwin was set as a free man. So we still actually don't know who the killer is, but all we know is this guy, this wrong guy, has served 25 years behind bars for no reason. At number 4, we have Andrew Wilson, who served 32 years behind bars. Andrew was convicted of stabbing to death 21-year-old man who was sleeping in his truck with his girlfriend back in 1984. When Andrew was arrested, he claimed he didn't kill anyone and they had the wrong person. According to Andrew's attorneys, key pieces of evidence were never turned over to the defense during the trial. It took 25 years for a new superior judge to claim that by withholding evidence, Andrew was deprived of his constitutional rights to a fair trial, and because of that, the judge ordered his release immediately from prison, so Andrew was able to be released from prison to take care of his 96-year-old mom. He got out just in time. Number 3, we have Eddie Collins, who is behind bars for 44 years. After spending 4 decades behind bars for the murder, he was finally a free man. He was released from the Arizona State Prison in Florence. Back in 1973, Eddie and his brother were involved in a drug deal in Tucson. His brother fatally shot Terry Young. Eddie's brother took a plea deal and he only served 10 years. Okay, hold on a second. Is this real life right now? So you're telling me that the killer took a plea deal and he's getting 10 years and the brother, who just happened to be with him, is in life in prison? So his brother served 44 years behind bars. The justice system, it just doesn't make sense here. Alright, number 2, let's talk about John Sam Hall, who served 50 years in prison after a mugging went tragically wrong in an alleyway in Detroit. When he was 17 years old, John was sentenced to life without parole. But like we've just learned about the new law, where minors, they're not allowed to be sentenced to life without parole. This is when a judge released him back into society. It's been half a century since this guy has lived in a normal world. So much has changed, and now around 70 years old, it's going to be very difficult for him to understand things. It's like being dropped off in a foreign country and they don't even speak your language. It could be very, very frustrating. Finally, number 1, we have Jack McCullough, who has also served 50 years behind bars. But unlike John at number 2, Jack served all of his time as an innocent person. Jack is from Washington State and the law failed him. He was convicted in the abduction and killing of a 7-year-old Illinois schoolgirl back in 1957. This girl's disappearance made headlines nationwide. There was a lot of unsolved answers during this trial, and just when the family thought that they had some closure finding out who the killer was, the killer's behind bars, the case was reopened, and it was proven that Jack wasn't the killer, and the killer is still out there. So saying that though, the family is still convinced that Jack is still guilty and he's actually the killer. Maybe they're in denial.
Starting us off with number 10 are Catherine and Curtis Fairchild Jones. In Melbourne, 1999, at 13 and 12 years old, Catherine and Curtis became the youngest people ever charged as adults for first-degree murder. The two shot their father's girlfriend Sonia and had plans to murder their father as well and another male relative for sexually molesting them. As soon as they had shot her, they realized what a huge mistake they'd made and they ran to their neighbor's house and said it was an accident. Even after evidence of abuse was found, no one did anything. No one believed the two were being abused and they were sent to jail. During their trial, they never brought up the abuse. Nothing about what they had endured was even mentioned. I mean, the man who was abusing them was convicted of sexually assaulting his girlfriend's daughter years prior. Why was this not brought up by their defense during their trial? I have no idea. Then the justice system failed them and they pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and were sentenced to 18 years and probation for life. They were both released in 2015 at 29 and 30 years old. That's basically your whole prime part of life all spent in jail.
Next up, number 9, we have Edward Mitchell, who was just served 20 years behind bars. Back in 1996, he was convicted of robbery. Edward was actually the right guy for the crime that happened back in 1996, so he's not innocent on our list. He robbed a 65-year-old man's jewelry store. Edwin was able to grab a diamond ring worth about $16,999. Of course, he was caught and he was sentenced to wait to 20 years. So Edward just simply outlived his sentence and he was released back into society. Well, Well, usually people who have served that much time, they know the bad atmosphere of, like, they know what prison's like, it's bad, they don't want to go there. So you get released, you become like a good boy, right? Well, for him, no, not what happened. Edward, he didn't learn his lesson. He actually robbed another jewelry store. This time he took a 9mm pistol into a pawn shop and he stole a bracelet, a wallet, a cell phone from an employee's lounge. Well, we don't know what his sentence is because he's actually still on the run. He's currently out there being crazy. So that's all the information at the time of this recording. He could be captured by now, but right now there is a warrant out for his arrest. At number 8, we have another man who has served 20 years behind bars. This right here is Juan Rivera. He has been in jail for a couple decades. While in prison, Juan has claimed his innocence. Well, after 20 years, he has been cleared by DNA as being the wrong person convicted for this crime. Juan said no amount of money could ever sum up to 20 years in prison, but he did win $20 million in a settlement. I mean, that is a lot of money, but 20 years of your life is gone. That's a long time. Anyone would go insane. Moving into number 7, we have William Barnhouse. Back in April 21st of 1992, a 22-year-old woman was raped behind a vacant building, and this took place in Muncie, Indiana. Well, this woman described to her best ability in the situation that she was in, what the man looked like, the man who raped her, to police officers. Well, that's when police officers set out and they found a man to this description. Officers took him back to the crime scene where they flashed a flashlight onto his face, and the woman identified him as the right guy. Well, in court, no one believed this man to be innocent, so the defense team then presented evidence to prove that William did suffer from mental illness his whole life. They probably did that so William can take a lesser sentence, a lesser punishment, because he was pleading insanity, he wasn't in the right state of mind. Well, they actually found him guilty, and they found him in the right state of mind for the crime. They deemed him as being capable of committing the crime, and he was sentenced away to 80 years in prison. Well, just this year, the Innocence Project and the Wrongfully Conviction Clinic at Indiana University stepped in and performed their own DNA testings, and it concluded that they actually have the wrong guy. When this was proven, Williams was immediately released. This is just a sad story. Number 6 is Timothy Bridges, and he served 25 years behind bars. That is a lifetime. He was sentenced away for rape and a burglary. Timothy was linked to this crime when 2 pieces of his hair was found at the scene back in 1991. Well, recently this case was reopened up. Well, it was discovered that there was evidence that police failed to turn over to the District of Attorney's office before his trial. It was also discovered that police wanted this man to be convicted to this crime because they actually made threats to people who made testimonies at the trial. So this guy went to jail because of what people said and not because of hard evidence. When the evidence was finally tested, Timothy actually wasn't even the right person. Apparently, this has become a problem of police interfering with investigations. There has been some cases where police believe they have the right suspect and they don't want the suspect to go free, so they make sure that this person is gonna get locked up. Whether the evidence is planted or, lack of evidence is given to the right people, they're gonna make sure who they believe committed the crime is going away for sure. Number 5, we have Anthony Sanborn, and he has served 27 years behind bars for the murder of his childhood girlfriend. His girlfriend was identified as 16-year-old Jessica Briggs, and he was sentenced to 70 years behind bars, but just recently it was proven that a key witness actually didn't even see the crime. So Anthony was released immediately. Imagine serving 27 years behind bars after someone had just killed your girlfriend and the whole world believes that you did it. I couldn't imagine Anthony's mindset. This murder was back in 1989 and the key witness testified, and the key witness was also the sole witness to the crime, but apparently the witness was threatened by police to tell the courts exactly what the police officer wanted them to say. But it was proven that the witness couldn't have actually seen this crime. Why? Well, they were actually legally blind. I mean, is this real life right now? What a fail. It just sucks it took 27 years to figure this one out. This one just really upsets me. Next up, number 4, let's talk about Christopher Abernathy. Christopher has served 28 years behind bars in a park forest. Christopher was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But instead of walking out with the cane at an old age, Christopher was able to hold his head up high, and step after step he was able to leave the prison where he maintained his innocence for 28 years. I am not even 28 years old. Imagine just my whole life just locked up away, like living the prison life. I bet after time, he probably thought, you know what, like maybe I did do this crime. Like why else am I locked up here for almost 3 decades? I mean, he probably went insane. Number 3, we have Randolph Arledge, who hasn't been living in society for the past 29 years. Back in 1981, 21-year-old Carolyn Armstrong was found on a dirt road. She was naked from the waist down with 40 stab wounds to the neck and chest. This trial went to court and Randolph was the main suspect, and despite the lack of evidence connecting this man to the crime, he was convicted of murder and he was sentenced to 99 years in prison. 2001, the Innocence Project stepped in, reopened the case. They were able to secure DNA testings of the physical evidence with the cooperation of the County District Attorney's Office. The testings concluded that the evidence found at the crime scene, which was some hair samples, wasn't actually Randolph's. It ended up being the victim's hair and hairnet. There was a new suspect, David Sims, and when he was confronted, he admitted he was the last one that saw her alive. That was his hairnet at the scene, and you know what? It was probably him then. I mean, everything is adding up here. So this is when Randolph was exonerated by the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals. At number 2, we have David McCallum, and he was convicted of murder when he was just 16 years old. He has served 29 years behind bars, while he has just been freed after a judge overturned his conviction, saying it was actually based on a false confession. The decision to free David was made at the recommendation of Brooklyn District Attorney Ken Thompson, who actually has helped turn over 10 convictions so far in less than a year of taking office. This is insane. Just think about that for a second. Less than a year, he's overturned 10 convictions. Like 10 people were wrongly imprisoned. I mean, what is going on in Brooklyn? Why are innocent people being locked up for decades for no reason? Why aren't people doing their jobs to find the right convicts who are still on the streets? Finally, number 1, we have an insane story about Joseph Sledge. Joseph was convicted of killing a mother, and this is back in 1976. This took place in Whiteville, North Carolina. Joseph has spent 40 years behind bars as an innocent person. Now at the age of 70 years old, he's now a free man. A judge claims that the system has actually made a mistake. DNA experts confirm that none of the evidence collected in the case, which was hair, there was DNA, fingerprints, well, it didn't belong to him. It was a district attorney who was not originally involved in the case who actually reopened the investigation. This is when they found the many mistakes in the case. When you're convicting someone of such harsh crimes and sentencing them away for like life for a very long time, it should be a slam dunk. With confidence, the legal system should know 100% that they have the right person. In at number 10, we have George Perrot, who was just 17 years old when he was arrested, and soon after he was convicted of rape and an assault that took place back in 1987. Well, George has spent 30 years in prison after it was deemed that he was actually wrongly convicted due to bogus FBI evidence.
He was convicted mainly on an FBI agent's testimony about a microscopic hair found in connection with the rape. But a judge found that evidence to be flawed and released Perrot on personal recognizance Wednesday.
This is why the justice system is just so messed up. A lot of times police officers or FBI agents are convinced, they're so convinced that this is the guy that committed the crime. So what they do is they do anything they can to get a conviction, to put this guy behind prison and to do it fast. Well, we have witnessed in the past them giving false statements, tampering with evidence, and a lot of times we have witnessed FBI agents and police officers get it wrong. They convicted the wrong person.
Did you ever lose hope after all those years?
No, absolutely. Of course. I've been in 30 years. A crime I didn't commit. Of course I lost hope.
For people who may not have hope, what do you want them to know? It's got to pull out.
Don't give up. Don't give up. That's for sure. Don't give up.
Moving on to number 9, we have Jesse Pomeroy. Jesse Pomeroy, otherwise known as the Boston Boy Fiend or the Boy Torturer, was convicted of countless murders at the age of 14 in 1875. He would abuse, torture, and then kill his victims. In fact, he was the youngest person in the history of Massachusetts to be convicted of first-degree murder. When Jesse was caught, he admitted to the murders and was sentenced to live in the Westboro Boys Reform School until he was 18. However, while at the school, he went on to commit other murders. That's when he was sentenced to prison and was placed in solitary confinement. His only interactions were with his guard and his mom, who would visit him once a month. In our our 8th spot, we have Ian Manuel. In 1990, when Ian Manuel was only 13 years old, he shot a woman in the face, blowing out part of her jaw during a robbery. Thankfully, she survived, but as a result of his crime, he was tried and convicted as an adult. As a result, he was sentenced to 65 years in prison. He was one of the youngest inmates in the Tampa State Penitentiary. Manuel spent 15+ years in isolation, making him the longest serving inmate in solitary confinement in Florida. Eventually, he was released after the woman he shot actually fought for his freedom, claiming everyone does dumb things when they're young, and she didn't want him to waste his life in jail. In our 7th spot, we have Ian Brady. Between 1963 and 1965, Ian Brady and his accomplice tortured, abused, and killed 5 individuals. They would bury their bodies on the moors outside of Manchester, which gave them the name the Moors Murderers. The crimes they committed were horrific, and Brady expressed no remorse. As a result, he was held in solitary confinement. His only contact with the outside world was through letters. It's said that on his free time he would memorize whole pages of Shakespeare and Plato and then recite them to himself. He would also often interact with television programs. Brady died in prison on May 15, 2017 at the age of 79. Making our way down the list, number 6, we have Dennis Rader. Between the years of 1974 to 1991, American serial killer Dennis Rader took the lives of 10 individuals. In 2005, he was convicted for his crimes, and now he's facing 175 years in solitary confinement without the possibility of parole. Now, Dennis likes to go by the name BTK, or the BTK Strangler, which stands for Bind 'em, Torture 'em, and Kill 'em. So that says a lot about who this guy is. But thankfully, he is locked away and has no chance of escaping. To this day, Dennis is considered one of the most diabolical serial killers in American history. We are now at our 5th and halfway mark with John Massey. In 1975, John Massey got into a fight with a pub's bouncer and he shot him in the chest. At the age of 26, he was sentenced to life for murder. But while in prison, Massey managed to successfully escape 3 times. His most notorious escape was when he made a makeshift rope out of sheets and a pair of heavy-duty gloves to climb over the prison wall. As a result of his escapes, he was placed in solitary confinement. He was allowed 15 minutes outside of his cell each day, and had only 8 minutes for a phone call. Other than that, he was kept locked away. He is considered one of Britain's longest serving prisoners. He was eventually released after spending nearly 43 years behind bars. In our 4th spot, we have Thomas Silverstein. Thomas Edward Silverstein was an American criminal jailed for armed robbery in 1978. But while in prison, he committed numerous other crimes. In 1983, he killed a prison officer who he stabbed multiple times. Then he murdered 2 inmates. As a result, he had to be detained in a specially designed cell at the ADX Florence Federal Penitentiary in Colorado. Due to the crimes he committed while in jail, he is considered the most violent prisoner in America. He is also referred to as America's most isolated man. Now, Silverstein was considered so dangerous that he got transferred to a federal prison in Atlanta. There he was confined in a 6-by-7 foot cell. He was constantly under surveillance. In fact, the lights in his cell were never turned off so that they could always keep an eye on him. Silverstein eventually died in prison at the age of 67. He is said to have served the longest term in solitary confinement in the federal penitentiary system. Coming in at number 3, we have AILEEN WUORNOS. AILEEN WUORNOS, often referred to as the Damsel of Death, was found guilty of killing 7 men. She claimed it was self-defense, but then later pleaded guilty to the murders. She would murder them, rob them, and then drive home in their cars. Due to this, she was named America's first female serial killer. Now, AILEEN was placed in solitary confinement for quite some time, but then she started to grow paranoid. She thought that the people making her food were spitting in it, and then she also claimed that she was being attacked by a sonic weapon. As a result, she wanted the court to hurry up with her death sentence. On October 9th, 2002, Aileen died by lethal injection. Moving on to number 2, we have Elizabeth Bathory. Elizabeth Bathory, otherwise known as the Countess who bathed in blood, was a serial killer in Hungary back in the 16th century. It's believed that she had killed around 650 girls. She's also considered the most vicious female serial killer in all recorded history. It's believed that her husband was a big influence in her killings. Apparently, he told her to torture her servants. He said for her to pour honey all over them and then let the bugs eat them. But her killings didn't truly start until she met a witch named Anna Darvula. This witch told Elizabeth that bathing in the blood of the young would help her maintain her youth. And that's exactly what she would do. Eventually, Elizabeth was sentenced to life in solitary confinement. She was locked up in her castle's torture chamber. The windows and doors were boarded up with her inside. There was only a small hole in which food was passed in through. On August 21st, 1611, she passed away. And in our number 1 spot, we have Robert Maudsley. Now, I've talked about Robert in my other video on dangerous criminals, and there's no way that I couldn't include him on this list. Robert Maudsley is considered Britain's most dangerous prisoner. Maudsley was originally convicted for 1 murder, however killed 3 more individuals in prison, which got him placed in solitary confinement. In 1977, Maudsley and his fellow inmate held another prisoner hostage. They ended up torturing him for 9 hours before cracking his head open and killing him. Now, it's rumored that he may have ate some of that prisoner's brain. As a result, he was deemed the real-life Hannibal Lecter. After that, he murdered 2 more inmates, which got him placed in solitary confinement. In fact, he is locked up in a glass cell underneath Wakefield Jail. He spends 23 hours of his day there.
So starting us off at number 10 with our first female in the series, we're talking about Noura Jackson. She was only 18 years old when she discovered her mother covered in blood and she was laying on their floor in their Memphis, Tennessee home. Jennifer became the prime suspect. While at this age, most teenagers, they're just finishing up their senior year of high school, they're making plans for what they want to take in college and university, they're making bad decisions in life, but they're no murderers. Well, for Noura, she is battling in court for the death of her mom. She is facing first-degree murder after her mother was stabbed 50 times. Jennifer was sentenced to 20 years and 9 months behind bars. It was just last year where Noura won her freedom after being in prison for about 11 years. This is such a crazy story. Noura's father was also murdered in 2004, and that murder also went unsolved. And for who killed her mom, we still don't know.
Coming in at number 9 is Atif Rafi and Sebastian Burns. Funnily enough, I knew about this case beforehand because it's a very good Netflix docu-series about different crimes, and it's called The Confession Tapes, and this was that first case it actually explored. Highly recommend, but anyway, in Bellevue back in 1994, Atif and his best friend Sebastian came back to Atif's family's house for the holidays. All was well until the boys came back from a long night out to discover Atif's parents and sister brutally murdered and his house a complete mess. After their murder, Atif inherited basically everything his parents had, buying a new car, living a new lifestyle, and seemingly not mourning the loss of his family at all. Police in both the US and Canada suspected the 2 boys of killing his family in order to get their money. They slandered them in the news like there was no tomorrow, branded them as murderers, and then using the Mr. Big technique to extract a confession from them. This technique is actually illegal in the US, but legal in Canada where it was done. It involves undercover cops gaining the suspect's trust by involving them in illegal activities and then getting them to confess. Even with multiple alibis and no physical evidence, the undercover cop kept probing Burns to confess and he would make it all go away. I'm assuming in the hopes of making his life go back to normal, Burns did confess, and later on so did Atif, even though their stories were completely different. Both were found guilty in 2004 of a triple murder and were both sentenced to 3 life sentences each, even though they've been in prison for the past 20 years. At first I thought, how could anyone murder their parents, but after doing this video and seeing how many people actually did, I was like, wow, this is a thing. This actually happens. At At number 8 is Joshua Smith. Now in February of 2012, 14-year-old Joshua broke into his stepfather Chico's room and stole his shotgun. Right after that, he started shooting things around the house, and Chico and his daughter were able to escape his rampage by breaking a window and climbing through. Joshua's mother, Tamiko Robertson, was sleeping on the sofa when he shot her around 12 to 14 times at close range. And why did he do this, you may be wondering? Because his mother was being a mother. That's right, Joshua started hanging out with the wrong crowd and wanted to join a gang, do drugs, pop pills. He started coming home at ridiculous hours, so Tamiko gave him a curfew and told him to stop hanging out with these people, and that's what triggered him. He pled guilty to second-degree murder and will be in jail for anywhere from 30 to 50 years. Filling our number 7 slot now is Evan Miller. Now Evan's life was hard enough. By the time he turned 14 in 2003, he'd been in and out of foster care due to his stepfather continuously beating him and his mother abusing drugs and alcohol. One day he was hanging out with his friends and his neighbor Cannon, who also happened to be one of his mum's drug dealers. After spending most of the night drinking and smoking weed, Evan and his friends attempted to rob Cannon after beating him. Evan beat him with a baseball bat and then set his trailer on fire, and he later died from his injuries and smoke inhalation. When brought to trial, his friend was offered life with a chance of parole if he testified against Evan, which obviously he did. In 2006, Evan was sentenced to life without parole, and now at 28 years old, he may have a chance at a retrial, but for now he's still very much in prison. Now at number 6 is Jacob P. Ind. Back in 1992, when Jacob was 15 years old, he killed his mum and his stepdad. After enduring years of sexual, physical, and emotional abuse, Jacob hired another older teen to help him murder his parents. Then, in the morning of December 17th, they went to their bedroom where they were fast asleep and attacked them for 5 whole minutes using various gruesome methods, stabbing them, spraying their faces with bear mace, and shooting them as well. He never testified during his first trial since his defense told him he would pack up and leave if he tried, so he was sentenced to life without parole. After spending 25 years in prison, he was finally granted a retrial and the right to testify back in August of 2018. And his retrial hasn't happened yet, so we don't know the conviction as of yet. Coming at number 5 is Diana Ortiz. Diana was 18 years old when she moved to New York in 1983 to flee an abusive relationship, and that's where she eventually met her new boyfriend, who was double her age. The man introduced her to drugs like heroin, LSD, and cocaine, and convinced that the only way to sustain both their habits was to stage a robbery. Note, not a murder, just a robbery. The plan was sorted. She would pose as a prostitute in a parking lot, wait for someone to approach her, and then her boyfriend and some friends would rob him. However, on the actual day, the victim that pulled up to her started fighting with the men, and a brawl ensued and he was eventually shot. While they all ran off in separate directions, what they had no clue about was that the customer was actually an off-duty police officer, and he actually died a few days later. Diana turned herself in and was convicted of felony murder and was sentenced to 17 years to life. And after 22.5 years in prison, she finally went on parole. Imagine 22.5 years in prison. I'm only 21 right now, and I feel like I lived a long life. That's my life and then some, all in prison. I can't even imagine that. At number 4 is Quantel Lotz. Now Lotz, like a lot of other kids on this list, had a troubled upbringing. His dad, mum, stepmom, uncles, aunts, basically everyone around him was addicted to cocaine, even getting high on it while he was still in the room at a very young age. He'd seen his uncle get shot multiple times because of drugs, and he himself was beaten on a regular basis. By 14, he used to have bouts of getting very angry, then crying uncontrollably, and then amnesia about what happened. In 1999, he was play fighting with his stepbrother Michael. It started off innocently, as it always does. Michael sent a blow dart his way, Lotz fired back with a toy bow and arrow, but then it turned very ugly and escalated into a proper fight. It ended with Lotz stabbing Michael a few times and then ultimately killing him. He literally doesn't remember the incident whatsoever. He just remembers being told the next day that his brother was dead and he was the reason. He was tried as an adult, not a juvenile, and was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Even though at 14 the state of Missouri thinks you're too young to legally get married, leave school, donate blood, get a tattoo without parental approval, yet you're old enough to be tried as an adult and then put away in jail forever. Filling in on number 3 slot is John Catus. Back in 2009, John was 16 at the time when he put up an ad on Craigslist offering sexual services in exchange for money, and the very popular ABC reporter George Webber replied to his ad. When they finally met up for this kinky hookup, if we can call it that, John claimed that George pulled a knife on him, and as self-defense he stabbed George 50 times. Mind you, George was bound and being choked when this happens, so I don't know how he could have even pulled a knife out to begin with. And if it was really self-defense, why 50 times? Surely someone's dead after maybe a few, or at least injured enough for you to escape the situation. During his hearings and his confession tapes, you can see him literally wink and smile throughout. At 18 years old, John was found guilty and was sentenced to 25 years to life, and at 28 years old, he's still in prison today. Now at number 2 is Ashley Jones. Ashley was a problem child raised by problematic parents. Her stepdad used to sexually molest her, and her mum was a drug addict, so it appeared to be a blessing when her grandparents agreed to take in her and her sister. I don't know if they agreed to take her in or her parents kicked her out, since she stabbed both her dad and her pregnant mum a year beforehand. Luckily neither died. A year later, at 14 years old, she was disobeying her grandparents more and more, and she was dating a boy they didn't approve of. The couple hatched a plan, and she helped her boyfriend commit a series of murders. First, they killed her granddad, shooting him twice in the face and then stabbing him to death. Then her aunt, who they shot in her sleep, and then set them both on fire. They also attacked her grandmom, who also got burned on the face, stabbed in the chest and jaw, and shot in the shoulder. Luckily, she survived, and she also tried to kill her own 10-year-old sister by stabbing her 14 times, but she also survived, thank God. Now at 24 years old, she's still in prison serving out her life sentence. And finally, at number 1 is Erin Caffey. Way back in March of 2008, Erin started dating a boy called Charlie Wilkinson. Story seems pretty kosher so far. After meeting Charlie, her parents felt like there was something off about him but didn't worry too much, but then Erin started to change. Her interests changed, her demeanor changed, and her parents thought Charlie was a bad influence and wanted them to break up. So what do any desperate teenagers do in that situation? Hatch a plan. Charlie and his friend Wade went into Erin's house while she waited in the car with Wade's girlfriend and shot Erin's mother Penny, whilst also nearly decapitating her with a katana. As if that wasn't bad enough, they then set the house on fire and it was completely ruined. Erin's father was also really badly injured. They shot him nearly 11 times whilst they killed Penny, but luckily he survived and was able to escape the house before it completely went up in flames. I mean, I don't know how lucky that is considering he survived his wife and kids and his remaining child is in jail, but it's still a good sign. Initially, no one suspected Erin, but during Charlie and Wade's questionings, they both said that the murders were Erin's idea. At 17 years old, Erin pleaded guilty to murder, as did Charlie, and they were both given 2 consecutive life sentences plus 25 years.
So starting us off on this list at number 10 is Susan Maria Mellon, who was a grandmother who was just walked free from prison after 17 years of being locked up behind bars. We're talking about Susan Marie Mellon, who was sent to prison after she was convicted of killing a homeless man. A Los Angeles County judge overturned her conviction, saying that her attorney has actually failed to properly represent her. Susan was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Well, she's lucky now because this case was actually relooked, it was reopened, and that was because the people linked to the crime ended up being 3 gang members, and yeah, Susan had nothing to do with it. They actually found the real people. So they're like, oh, if they are the ones that committed this crime, who the heck are you? Now at number 9, we have 92-year-old Drayton Curry. He is considered to be the oldest inmate in federal prison. Dayton was almost pardoned from former President Barack Obama. So the reason why he was waiting for Barack Obama to pardon him from jail was because Drayton was convicted and has already served 20 years for a non-violent drug conviction. Former President Barack Obama actually reduced sentencing for 1,385 individuals for non-violent drug charges, and hundreds of these inmates were released from prison. He said the sentencing back in the day was way too harsh for such crime. He served so much time, and it's probably just for like a weed charge or something, and it's insane because like here in Canada, weed's gonna become legal next year, and in some of the states, maybe the state that he was convicted in, weed's probably now legal. Moving into number 8, we have Arthur Schnipper, who is a 92-year-old man who was born in 1924. Just think about that for a second. He should be kicking up his feet and enjoying his retired life with family and friends, but instead, he has been convicted of aggravated murder in Montgomery County. His sentence was life in prison. Arthur has been behind bars since 1983. He has served 33 years so far. Arthur, while he was 59 years years old, shot and killed his girlfriend while he was wearing a disguise. Well, the disguise wasn't good enough because he was caught. His next parole hearing is in 2021, so that's in about 4 years from now. Arthur will be 96 years old. I'm not really sure how the hearing will go because he has already served more than life behind bars, and usually convicts are assessed to see, if they pose a danger to society. And if the answer is no, they're released. 94-year-old John Bunce, who is a retired chemist, comes into this list at number 7. This is New York's oldest prison inmate. He was convicted of brutally killing his wife. John beat his wife to death with a hammer. John hit her about 30 times. He was married to his wife for 68 years. This guy has gone insane. His wife was 89 years old, so this all happened back in 2010, and he was sentenced to just 17 and a half years behind prison. Which means when he is 112 years old, he's gonna be able to maybe be released. John has had a history of trying to kill himself. In court, he was ordered to a mental test to ensure he was mentally fit to be sentenced. I think if you're able to kill someone, then yeah, you're mentally fit to do the time. Well, in 2014, he actually passed away. Number 6, we have our first female on this list, and we're talking about Lucille Keppen, who is 93 years old. Lucille is a widow who outlived all of her family members. Her husband and 2 sons have passed away. Back in 2002, she was sentenced away after she shot and seriously wounded Stephen Fleshy, and that was her 63-year-old neighbor. She pleaded guilty to first-degree assault. Lucille is one of the few people on this list to have remorse and to feel bad about what she has done. She has expressed forgiveness to the person she shot. She's in a very bad place right now. Moving on to number 4, we have another female on this list, and actually the oldest female on this list as well. This right here is a 100-year-old Ohedinesa who has served 19 years in prison. She was in prison for a murder. Ohedinesa actually went to jail with 16 members of her family who apparently were all involved with the murder. Her son, her husband died in jail while they were all serving a life sentence. Right now, she is not able to take care of herself at all. She is always in pain, she can't walk, and she can't really do anything. Maybe this is why she was released from prison, because she poses no threat at all to society. Number 3, we have John Fanzesi, who is 100 years old as well. John is an Italian-born American. He is a mobster who has been in and out of jail his whole life. Back in 1967, he was in prison for 12 years. This was after he was convicted of masterminding several bank robberies. Masterminding, maybe not so much because he was caught, so how masterful was he really? During the prosecution, people thought that John Fanzesi killed between 30 or 50 people, so for this he was sentenced to 50 years in jail. But like I said, he only served 12 years of that time. 4 years later, he was back in prison for a parole violation. He was jailed for 2 years at the time. In 2010, he was sent to jail for 8 years, which means he actually should be out next year. I'm not even sure if this guy has it in him to, commit any more crimes. I mean, this guy's 100 years old. Finally, number 1, we have a 108-year-old Hindu priest, Brej Pandey, who was convicted of murder back in 1987 when he was 84 years old. Brej is India's oldest ever inmate and was the oldest person in the world that I was able to come across who is in prison. Well, he was released from jail after serving a lengthy sentence. He wasn't able to walk out of jail on his own. He was actually carried out by his relatives. It's just so crazy to think that this guy was able to outlive his prison sentence.